I often find that the most significant shifts in the history of nations do not arrive with the sound of an explosion, but with the quiet stroke of a pen on a contract. We are conditioned to look for the loud moments, the elections, the conflicts, the protests that fill our screens with urgent chyrons. But if you only watch the noise, you miss the signal. You miss the architectural changes happening in the basement of the global order. And this recent story, this announcement that Microsoft is investing $1.5 billion into a company called G42 in the United Arab Emirates, is perhaps the perfect example of a signal disguised as a business headline. To the casual observer, this looks like just another tech deal. It looks like a wealthy Gulf nation diversifying its portfolio, throwing money at the buzzing hype of artificial intelligence. You see the photo ops. You see the press releases filled with corporate buzzwords about synergy and innovation. You see the dollar figure 1.5 billion, and while it is a large number, in the world of trillion-dollar tech valuations, it might seem like a rounding error. But to view this deal through the lens of finance is to fundamentally misunderstand what just happened. This is not a story about venture capital. This is not a story about a software license. This is a story about a geopolitical pivot point where the tectonic plates of the American tech empire and the Middle Eastern strategic ambition collided and then locked into place. It is the moment where the United Arab Emirates, a nation built on the black gold of the 20th century, decided to bet its entire national survival on the digital oil of the 21st. And more importantly, it is the moment they chose exactly whose tank they would store that oil in. Let me walk you through the context that makes this unprecedented. For the last 50 years, the compact between the United States and the Gulf was simple, legible, and physical. The Gulf provided energy security oil, and the United States provided physical security ships, jets, and defense guarantees. It was a relationship built on atoms, on tangible commodities that you could touch, barrel, and ship. But the world you and I live in today is no longer governed solely by the movement of atoms. It is governed by the movement of electrons, by the flow of data, and by the compute power required to process the intelligence that runs our economies. The leaders in Abu Dhabi, specifically the royal family and the strategic thinkers behind G42, recognized a terrifying truth about the future. They realized that oil, for all its historic power, is a depreciating asset in a decarbonizing world. It is a resource with an expiration date. If a nation's entire identity and stability are anchored to a resource the world is trying to quit, that nation has two choices. It can manage its own slow decline, or it can violently pivot toward the next engine of history. The UAE chose the pivot, and they identified artificial intelligence not just as a sector to invest in, but as the foundational infrastructure of their future sovereignty. This brings us to G42. You may not have heard of G42 before this headline. It is often described in the press as an AI holding company, but that description is woefully inadequate. G42 is effectively a national champion, an arm of the state disguised as a corporation, chaired by Sheikh Tahnoon bin Zayed Al Nahyan, the National Security Advisor. When G42 moves, it is not just seeking profit, it is executing national strategy. It is the vehicle through which the UAE intends to transition from a consumer of Western technology to a global custodian of it. But here is where the friction enters the story. For years, the UAE, like many non-aligned nations, tried to play both sides of the increasingly Cold War between the United States and China. In a world of globalization, this made sense. You buy your fighter jets from America, but you buy your telecommunications infrastructure from Hawaii because it is cheaper and efficient. You send your students to Harvard, but you sell your oil to Beijing. This strategy of hedging works when the world is stable. It works when trade is just trade. However, as artificial intelligence began to accelerate, the nature of trade changed. AI is not like buying a toaster or a car. AI requires deep integration into a nation's data, its healthcare records, its surveillance systems, and its military logistics. You cannot be neutral about the operating system that runs your country. The United States government began to look at the UAE's reliance on Chinese hardware with growing alarm. They saw American chips, the most advanced technology on Earth, potentially sitting in data centers physically wired together with Chinese equipment. This was the red line. And this is why the Microsoft deal is so much more than a transaction. It was the culmination of months of shadow diplomacy. The United States effectively presented a choice to their partners in the Gulf. You can have access to the future, to the advanced models like GPT-4, to the H100 chips that power them, to the Microsoft cloud infrastructure. But you cannot have it if the Chinese Communist Party has a backdoor key to the server room. The $1.5 billion investment was the public sizzle. It was the ribbon-cutting ceremony. But the quiet mechanism underneath was a sweeping diplomatic agreement. Microsoft didn't just buy equity, they bought compliance, they bought a guarantee. G42 agreed to strip out Chinese hardware from its core infrastructure. They agreed to store their data on the Microsoft Azure cloud. They agreed, in effect, to migrate their national digital nervous system out of the gray zone of neutrality and firmly into the architecture of the West. Why does this matter to you, sitting perhaps thousands of miles away from the Persian Gulf? It matters because it signals the end of the open, globalized internet we once took for granted. We are entering an era of the stack. Nations are realizing that they must choose a technology stack, an ecosystem of chips, clouds, and code, and that choice will determine their political alliances for decades. The UAE just made their choice. They calculated that American innovation is still the safest bet for long-term survival. But let's pause and look at the sheer scale of ambition here. We are talking about a country that was largely desert a century ago, now attempting to position itself as the AI nation. This is not merely about installing some servers. It is about transforming the very physics of their economy. They are building massive data centers in environments that are naturally hostile to electronics, places of extreme heat and sand. They are redirecting their energy grid, largely powered by the very hydrocarbons they are trying to transcend, to cool the silicon brains that they hope will replace the oil wells. The Microsoft deal validates this ambition. It tells the global market that the UAE is a safe place for Western data. It is a seal of approval from the highest levels of American commerce and, by extension, the American security apparatus. Brad Smith, the president of Microsoft, didn't just sign a check, he signed a treaty. And in doing so, he proved that in 2024, the State Department and the boardroom are often working on the same file. There is a seductiveness to the headline, isn't there? Microsoft invests billions. It sounds like growth. It sounds like progress. But if you listen closely to the hum of those new servers coming online in the desert, you hear the sound of doors closing. The door to a world where a nation could be friends with everyone is shutting. The door to a global internet where hardware was just a commodity is locking. We are seeing the lines being drawn on the map, not with barbed wire, but with fiber optic cables. The UAE has looked at the horizon and seen the storm gathering between the great powers. And rather than wait to be caught in the rain, they have built a shelter out of American software. This is the reality of the sizzle. It distracts you with the promise of wealth, while the mechanism underneath quietly realigns the geopolitical order. And we are only on page 1 of this new chapter. To truly understand the weight of this moment, we have to peel back the layers of what I call the hidden mechanism. The headline story is about investment, but the real story, the one that historians will likely focus on, is about the ultimatum. For the past decade, the United States has watched with increasing anxiety as Chinese technology firms, most notably Huawei, wove themselves into the telecommunications fabric of the Middle East. It was a logical commercial victory for China. They offered state-of-the-art equipment at prices that Western competitors could not match, subsidized by the Chinese state, and delivered with a handshake that asked for no political questions. For the Gulf states, this was a transaction of convenience. If you are building a futuristic city in the desert and you need 5G towers, fiber optics, and surveillance cameras, you buy from the vendor who delivers the best product for the best price. Ideology rarely enters the procurement office, but technology is no longer neutral. As we moved from simple communication networks to the era of generative AI and cloud computing, the hardware ceased to be just plumbing. It became the vessel for the most sensitive intelligence a nation possesses. The United States government, operating through the National Security Council and the Commerce Department, began to view the presence of Chinese hardware in the Gulf not just as a commercial annoyance, but as a critical security breach. The fear was specific. If the UAE becomes a hub for advanced artificial intelligence, using American-designed chips from NVIDIA and running American models like those from OpenAI, that intellectual property and that data cannot sit on a network that Beijing might be able to access. This is where the chip war enters the narrative. You might have followed the restrictions the U.S. placed on exporting advanced semiconductors to China. These chips, specifically the H100 graphics processing units, are the fuel of the AI revolution. They are the scarcest and most valuable commodity in the technology world right now. To be a modern economy, you need them. But the U.S. controls the choke point. They control the intellectual property and the export licenses. So the mechanism of this deal was effectively a trade. The UAE wanted the chips. They wanted the keys to the AI kingdom. The United States said, you can have them. You can be a global leader. You can have Microsoft, the world's most valuable company, as your partner. But first, you must clean your house. This was the ultimatum. It was a diplomatic lever pulled with extraordinary force, but done so quietly that most of the world missed it. G42 was the focal point of this tension. American intelligence agencies had reportedly raised concerns about G42's historical ties to Chinese entities, concerns about where their data flowed, and concerns about the genetic and surveillance projects they had undertaken. For a moment, it looked like G42 might be blacklisted, cut off from American technology entirely. That would have been a death sentence for the UAE's tech ambitions. You cannot build a world-class AI ecosystem on second-rate hardware. The negotiation that followed is a masterclass in modern statecraft. Sheikh Tahnoun and his advisors made a calculated decision. They realized that while China offered cheap hardware, the United States offered the standard. The West still controls the fundamental architecture of the high-end digital economy. To be cut off from the U.S. chip supply chain would be to relegate the UAE to a second-tier status for decades. So they agreed to the divestment. Microsoft entered as the guarantor of this cleanup. The $1.5 billion investment effectively pays for the cost of switching sides. It creates a commercial incentive that binds G42 to American standards. By moving their core operations onto Microsoft's Azure cloud, G42 is placing its data inside a legal and technical fortress that is compliant with U.S. regulations. This is the mechanism at work. It is a sterilization of the digital environment to make it safe for American intellectual property. Consider the complexity of stripping out existing infrastructure. This is not like uninstalling an app from your phone. We are talking about physical hardware, servers, routers, and switches that form the backbone of a network. The commitment to remove Chinese gear is a commitment to a costly, difficult, and physically disruptive process. It shows just how valuable the prize, access to American AI, really is. The UAE is willing to tear up its own floorboards to get it. This shift illustrates the concept of the Silicon Curtain descending across the world. We are seeing a bifurcation. On one side, a block of nations running on Western technology, adhering to Western standards of data privacy, however imperfect, and integrated into the American defense umbrella. On the other side, a block running on Chinese technology, integrated into Beijing's digital Silk Road. The non-aligned space in the middle is shrinking rapidly. You cannot easily mix the two systems anymore. The latency is too high, and the trust is too low. The Microsoft G42 deal proves that when push comes to shove, digital sovereignty often means choosing a sovereign protector. The UAE is asserting its sovereignty by building its own AI capabilities. Yes, they are developing their own Arabic language models like J's. They are training their own algorithms. But they are doing so on a foundation provided by the United States. They have accepted that total independence is a myth. The reality is interdependence, and they have chosen to be interdependent with the victors of the Silicon Age. This mechanism also reveals the evolving role of the American corporation. Microsoft is acting almost as a deputized agent of the State Department. Brad Smith negotiated safeguards that look more like an arms control treaty than a business contract. The deal includes provisions that allow Microsoft to audit G42's use of the technology, ensuring it isn't used for surveillance or human rights abuses that would embarrass the U.S. This is a level of corporate oversight into a sovereign nation's national champion that is truly unprecedented. It suggests that in the future, the most powerful ambassadors may not work for the government at all. They may work for the cloud providers. If Microsoft or Google or Amazon controls the infrastructure upon which a nation's economy sits, they hold a lever of influence that rivals traditional diplomacy. The UAE has invited this influence in exchange for capability. They have traded a degree of autonomy for the velocity of progress. This is the hidden engine of the deal. It is a story of leverage. The U.S. leveraged its monopoly on chips. The UAE leveraged its capital and its strategic geography. And Microsoft leveraged its position as the trusted broker. The result is a realignment that secures the Persian Gulf, historically an energy partner, as a digital partner for the next half-century. The Chinese hardware that is being ripped out is not just electronic waste. It is the debris of a failed bid for dominance in the region. And as you watch this mechanism lock into place, you have to ask who is next. This ultimatum will not stop in Abu Dhabi. Every nation that wants access to the cutting edge of AI will face a similar choice. The neutral path is vanishing. The mechanism demands that you pick a side, plug in, and accept the terms of service. The UAE just read the terms, and they clicked accept. Now that we have established the political maneuvering, we must turn our attention to the physical reality of this new era. It is easy to think of artificial intelligence as something ethereal, a ghost in the machine that lives in the cloud. The very metaphors we use, cloud, web, virtual, are designed to make us forget the heavy industrial physicality of the internet. But the deal between Microsoft and the UAE is not about magic. It is about concrete, copper, water, and electricity. It is about the infrastructure of power. When the UAE speaks of digital sovereignty, they are not speaking in abstract philosophical terms. They are speaking about the tangible construction of data centers that rival the size of aircraft carriers. To host the kind of AI models that G42 wants to run, models that can simulate weather patterns, decode genomic sequences, and optimize logistics for entire cities, you need computing power on a scale that is difficult to comprehend. These are not server rooms, they are industrial plants. This brings us to the paradox of the UAE's position. For decades, their power came from what they pulled out of the ground. Oil was the blood of the industrial age. It fueled the cars, the ships, and the factories of the 20th century. But the 21st century runs on information, and unlike oil, which you just have to extract and sell, information requires energy to process. This is the great irony. The post-oil future is intensely energy-hungry. AI models are voracious consumers of electricity. A single query to a large language model consumes significantly more energy than a standard Google search. Training a model like GPT-4 consumes gigawatt hours of power. So, when Microsoft looks at the UAE, they don't just see a pile of cash. They see a nation that understands energy. They see a country that has the capital to build massive solar parks and nuclear power plants. The UAE is one of the few nations that has successfully brought a nuclear program online for peaceful energy generation, the Barakah nuclear energy plant. This infrastructure is the chessboard upon which the game is played. Microsoft needs places to build. They are running out of power capacity in Virginia and Northern California. The grids in the West are old, regulated, and slow to expand. The grid in the Gulf is relatively new, state-controlled, and can be expanded by decree. If the sheik says, build a gigawatt of solar capacity here for the data center, it gets built. There are no town hall meetings to block the view. This speed of infrastructure deployment is a competitive advantage that the UAE is leveraging to court American tech giants. But this infrastructure faces a formidable enemy, the climate itself. We are talking about placing the hottest running machines on Earth, high-performance GPU clusters, into one of the hottest natural environments on Earth. The engineering challenge of cooling these data centers in the Arabian desert is immense. It requires water, another scarce resource in the region, or advanced liquid cooling technologies that are still being perfected. Why go to this trouble? Why build the engine in the desert? Because the UAE wants to own the digital Suez Canal. Just as the physical Suez Canal controls the flow of goods between East and West, the UAE wants to control the flow of data. By building this infrastructure, they position themselves as the connectivity hub for the global South, for Africa, for the Middle East, and for Central Asia. They want the data of 1 billion people to flow through servers sitting on Emirati soil, governed by Emirati law, and processed by algorithms owned by Emirati companies. This is the physical manifestation of sovereignty. If your banking data, your health records, and your government services are processed in a data center in Virginia, you are a client state. If they are processed in a data center in Abu Dhabi, you are a sovereign player. The Microsoft deal is the catalyst that allows the UAE to upgrade from a client to a player. They are importing the brains, the chips, and the software, but the body, the data center, stays home. However, this infrastructure brings with it a profound vulnerability. In the old days, if you wanted to threaten the UAE, you threatened the Straits of Hormuz. You threatened the oil tankers. Today, the vulnerability has shifted. If your economy runs on cloud infrastructure, you are vulnerable to cyber attacks, to cable severing, and to remote kill switches. By integrating so deeply with Microsoft, the UAE is trusting that the Americans will never turn off the service. They are trusting that the software updates will keep coming. This is a new kind of dependency. It is an entanglement that is much harder to break than an oil contract. You can sell oil to someone else tomorrow. You cannot easily migrate exabytes of data and proprietary algorithms to a new cloud provider overnight. The infrastructure of power is sticky. Once you build it, you are married to the vendor. The UAE has effectively married Microsoft and, by extension, the U.S. tech ecosystem. We must also consider the human infrastructure, the talent pipeline. You cannot run these systems with just money and sand. You need engineers. The UAE has been aggressively reforming its visa laws, creating golden visas to attract the best minds in coding and data science from around the world. They know they cannot breed enough homegrown talent fast enough to keep up with the pace of AI. So they are importing the brains just as they import the chips. This cosmopolitan ambition is part of the infrastructure. They are building a society that is hospitable to the global technocrat. They are creating a neutral zone for talent, even if the technology itself is no longer geopolitically neutral. This is a delicate balancing act. They want the Russian cryptographer, the Chinese hardware engineer, and the American software developer to all live in Dubai, working on systems that are increasingly aligned with Washington. So when you look at the skyline of Dubai or Abu Dhabi, do not just see the luxury hotels. Look for the windowless concrete buildings on the outskirts. Look for the solar fields stretching into the dunes. That is where the real history is being written. That is the new infrastructure of power. The U is betting that whoever holds the compute capacity holds the future. And they are spending every petrodollar they have to ensure that when the oil runs dry, the servers are still humming. We have examined the deal, the hidden mechanism, and the physical infrastructure. Now, we must widen the aperture to look at the broader phenomenon. This deal represents the birth of AI diplomacy. For centuries, diplomacy was conducted through the exchange of ambassadors, the signing of defense pacts, and the trade of physical goods. Nations aligned themselves based on ideology or military protection. But today, we are witnessing a new form of statecraft where the alignment of code is as important as the alignment of borders. The Microsoft G42 partnership is the inaugural case study of this new era. It proves that in the modern world, nations aren't just buying weapons to secure alliances, they are aligning their data centers with specific superpowers. This is a profound shift in how we understand geopolitical gravity. The gravitational pull of a superpower is no longer just about its aircraft carriers, it is about its API endpoints. It is about who controls the access to the intelligence that will define the next generation of economic growth. Think about what it means for the Middle East. For decades, the region was defined by conflict, by oil, and by a complex web of religious and political tensions. Now, a new layer is being placed on top of that history, the layer of technological competition. Saudi Arabia is watching this deal with intense interest. They, too, have massive ambitions for AI. They, too, have deep pockets, and they, too, are being courted by China and the United States. The UAE's decision to side with the U.S. creates a pressure wave across the region. It sets a precedent. It suggests that if you want to be a Tier 1 digital economy, you have to play by American rules. This is soft power, reinvented as hard code. The United States is using its dominance in the innovation sector to reknit alliances that were fraying. There was a narrative just a few years ago that the U.S. was retreating from the Middle East, that it was pivoting to Asia and leaving a vacuum for China to fill. And China did try to fill it with telecommunications infrastructure and belt and road projects. But AI has given the U.S. a new trump card. China can build bridges and ports, but currently, they cannot provide the H100 chips or the generative AI models that are the envy of the world. By controlling the bottleneck of this technology, Washington has found a way to reassert its influence without firing a shot or deploying a single soldier. They are saying, "You want the future, it comes through us." And the UAE, pragmatic as ever, accepted this reality. This is AI diplomacy in action, using technological superiority to force geopolitical alignment. But this comes with risks. We are creating a world of digital blocks. If the internet fractures into a U.S. sphere and a China sphere, what happens to the countries that don't want to choose? What happens to the global south? We might see a digital version of the non-aligned movement. But as I noted earlier, neutrality is technically difficult. If your medical system runs on Microsoft Azure and your traffic system runs on Hawaii Cloud, how do they talk to each other? The friction of incompatibility will force nations to pick a lane. The UAE's pivot also challenges the very notion of sovereignty. What does it mean to be a sovereign nation if your critical infrastructure is dependent on a foreign corporation? In the past, sovereignty meant controlling your borders and your currency. Today, digital sovereignty is often described as controlling your data. But if your data resides on a cloud architecture designed in Redmond, Washington, and secured by U.S. export controls, is it truly yours? The UAE would argue that partnership is the new sovereignty. By sitting at the table with Microsoft, by owning the models and the applications, they retain control over the value of the data, even if they depend on the tools of the partner. They are betting that they can be a smart power, small in size but massive in influence because of their technological capability. They want to be the Singapore of the Middle East, a node so critical to the global network that no one can afford to bypass it. This deal also sends a signal to Beijing. It tells China that their strategy of no strings attached infrastructure investment has a ceiling. China offered cheap gear without political lectures, but they could not offer the cutting-edge AI performance. It turns out that nations, at least wealthy, ambitious ones, prioritize performance over non-interference. They are willing to accept the strings of the U.S. if it means getting the Ferrari of AI models rather than the sedan. Furthermore, consider the cultural implications of AI diplomacy. AI models carry cultural values. They are trained on datasets that reflect specific worldviews, languages, and histories. When the UAE adopts American AI models, even if they fine-tune them, they are importing a certain cognitive architecture. To counter this, they are heavily investing in JAYS, their Arabic language model. They want to ensure that the Arab world is not just a consumer of Western digital thought, but a producer of its own. This is the cultural front of the war. Sovereignty is also about narrative. It is about ensuring that when an Arab child asks an AI a question about history or religion, the answer doesn't just come from a perspective baked in Silicon Valley. The Microsoft deal includes provisions to help develop these local models. It is a recognition that true AI diplomacy must be reciprocal. The U.S. gets the geopolitical alignment, the UAE gets the tools to preserve its cultural identity in the digital age. The stakes of this diplomacy are existential. If you choose the wrong alliance and that ally falls behind technologically, your entire economy stagnates. The UAE has looked at the trajectory of U.S. innovation versus Chinese innovation in high-end semiconductors and generative AI, and they have decided the momentum is with the West. They are hedging against the risk of Chinese stagnation in the tech sector due to sanctions. So when we look at the map of the Middle East now, do not just see borders drawn in the sand by colonial powers a century ago. See the fiber optic cables, see the data centers, see the flow of encrypted traffic. That is the new map. And on that map, the UAE has just drawn a thick, bright line connecting Abu Dhabi to Seattle. It is a lifeline, a power line, and a fault line all in one. As we reach the conclusion of this exploration, I want to step back from the boardrooms and the situation rooms to look at what this means for the human experience, for the citizen. Both in the UAE and around the world, we often discuss geopolitics as if it were a game played above our heads, a chess match between royals and CEOs. But the consequences of the Microsoft G42 alliance will filter down into the texture of daily life in ways we are only beginning to understand. We are witnessing the end of the universal digital commons. For 30 years, the dream of the internet was that it was a borderless place. A packet of data sent from Dubai flowed to Shanghai or San Francisco with indifference to politics. That era is over. We are entering the age of the splinternet, but a version far more complex than just a firewall. We are entering a world where the underlying logic of your reality, the AI that curates your news, manages your health, and educates your children, depends entirely on which geopolitical bloc your country has subscribed to. For the citizen in the UAE, this pivot brings a promise of acceleration. It means their hospitals might soon use diagnostic tools far in advance of their neighbors. It means their schools might have personalized tutors powered by the world's best models. It means their government services could become hyper-efficient, predicting needs before they arise. This is the dividend of the sizzle. It is the reward for aligning with the technological leader. But it also brings a new kind of transparency and perhaps a loss of privacy. By integrating so deeply with the U.S. tech stack, the digital lives of the region become entangled with the surveillance and regulatory frameworks of the West. And conversely, for the American citizen, it means that your tech giants, the companies that manage your email and your documents, are now deeply financially dependent on foreign sovereigns. Microsoft's growth is now partly tethered to the ambitions of the Gulf. The lines between national, corporation, and global utility are blurring. There is a deeper philosophical question here about responsibility. When a nation decides to host the infrastructure of the future, it is not just hosting machines, it is hosting the moral weight of those machines. AI is not neutral. It makes decisions, it allocates resources, it profiles risks. By pivoting to the U.S., the UAE is effectively importing the Western framework of AI ethics, or the lack thereof. They're importing the debates about copyright, about bias, about safety. These debates are no longer confined to California. They are now domestic policy issues in Abu Dhabi. And what of the world that is left behind? As the U.S. and its allies consolidate their trusted network and China consolidates its own, the gap widens for the developing nations that cannot afford the entry fee. The Microsoft G42 deal is a high-end club membership. It signals a future where digital sovereignty is a luxury good. If you are a poor nation, you may not get to choose your alignment. You may simply have to accept whatever digital colonialism is offered to you. The UAE has bought its way out of that fate, but its move highlights the disparity for everyone else. This story also forces us to rethink the definition of a superpower. Is a superpower the nation with the most nukes, or the nation that controls the weights and biases of the dominant AI model? The UAE has recognized that they can never compete with the US or China on population or landmass, but by becoming a node in the American AI network, they become indispensable. They become a keystone species in the geopolitical ecosystem. If you remove them, the structure wobbles. That is a powerful place to be. But let's return to the quiet truth I mentioned at the beginning. The most fascinating part of this story is the silence of the oil. For a century, the pulse of the Middle East was the rhythm of the pumjack. It was the smell of crude. That era is not gone, but it is walking into the sunset. The new pulse is the hum of the cooling fan. The new resource is the token, the parameter, the bit. The UAE's pivot is a recognition that the earth below their feet is less important than the cloud above their heads. This transition is terrifying and exhilarating. It requires a nation to fundamentally rewrite its social contract. The skills that made you successful in the oil age, geology, drilling, heavy engineering, are not the skills that save you in the AI age. The UAE is racing to retrain an entire population to change the mindset of a culture from extraction to innovation. And this Microsoft deal is the starter pistol for that race. So, as you watch the headlines fade and the next crisis take over the news cycle, remember this moment. Remember the moment when the Silicon Curtain fell across the desert. It is a reminder that sovereignty is not something you possess, it is something you perform. It is something you build decision by decision, server by server. The UAE has made its choice. It has traded the illusion of neutrality for the security of capability. For you, the viewer, the lesson is clear. The technology you use is political. The cloud you store your photos in has a flag. The AI you chat with has a nationality. We are no longer just citizens of a country. We are citizens of a stack. And as the world divides into these digital empires, we will all have to ask ourselves, whose infrastructure do we trust? Whose laws govern our digital souls? The 1.5 billion figure will be forgotten. The names of the CEOs will change. But the infrastructure being laid down today, the cables, the treaties, the alignments, will shape the nervous system of the world for the rest of this century. The quiet mechanisms have turned, the gears have locked, the pivot is complete, and the future, whether we are ready for it or not, has found its new home. If this deep dive into the hidden mechanics of our world resonated with you, if you want to understand the forces shaping your reality beyond the breaking news, stay with me. Subscribe, share this discussion, and let's continue to pull back the curtain on the quiet revolutions that define our times. The world is changing faster than the headlines can capture, and it is only by stopping to look at the machinery underneath that we can hope to understand where we are going. Thank you for thinking with me.